So, I am so excited about our next speaker. This is Lynn Paltrow. She is an attorney. She's the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women, who, if you haven't heard of them, figure that out right now. Lynn is also a Gemini, and possibly most importantly, she's a mother of twins. Welcome.
I'm very excited to be here. I'm very grateful to Bernadette Hoppy, who I believe is the person who connected me to the National Perinatal Association, and to the people who made this year's conference possible, including, but not everybody, because I mess up names easily, Joelle, Erica, and Christy. I really appreciate the information you sent out about language. I may not get it all right, but it is exactly the kind of thing we need to think about in a way that was presented to us in that flyer, if you got it. How many of you saw the language thing? Raise your hand. You know, it was compassionate to us who read it. Some people didn't, so let's make sure everybody sees that. I have some good news to start with. The National Perinatal Association, among other things, often is represented as an amicus, a friend of the court, in cases that we work on. And one of the cases that we work on, and the NPA was the only group to at least try to submit a friend of the court brief, was the M. Bynum case in Arkansas. It doesn't specifically involve the kind of drugs we're talking about today. This is a woman who sought to end her pregnancy early by using the drug misoprostol so that she could not be pregnant any longer, give her baby to somebody to be adopted. Things did not go as planned. She experienced a stillbirth at home. She had told many people about her pregnancy, but not her mother, who she feared would throw her out of the house. She had a stillbirth at home, cleaned up afterwards, safeguarded the fetal remains in a car near the house, and 8 hours later went to the hospital after speaking to her lawyer and calling other people with the fetal remains, asking to see a doctor. Shortly thereafter, she was arrested for the crime of concealing a birth and abuse of corpse. She was convicted of concealing a birth, something with a multiple-year penalty. And the good news yesterday was that her conviction was overturned. Unfortunately, it was not overturned on constitutional grounds, but it was overturned. I'm very grateful to NPA for their support, because it can go back to trial again, and this time we will be representing Ms. Bynum from the division, and all of the constitutional arguments will be preserved. So, so this is called Understanding the Legal Landscape, Using Substance Use to Criminalize Pregnancy and Parenting. So, first of all, I have to do my disclosure. There it is. Understanding the legal landscape requires a brief look back. How did we get to the legal landscape we're in? So looking back on media coverage of the so-called cocaine epidemic, crack epidemic, there were stories over and over again, like the one in Time magazine in 1990, crack kids, their mothers use drugs and their children suffer. So you have a narrative that is set up about mothers who are guilty and children who are innocent, and you see the innocent victims. And as the story in the New York Times and the Time magazine got more detailed, and by the time you get to the actual story, it's about how these children are going to be in school with your children, taking away important public resources. Do you notice what happens to the skin color of the kid? Right? As it becomes more menacing, the skin color gets darker. There is a narrative here not only about drugs, it's about race, it's about maternal responsibility and blame. Coverage around the crack epidemic, or so-called crack epidemic, because it wasn't really one, it wasn't widespread everywhere, was everywhere. The Rolling Stones, babies born to crack-addicted mothers are like no others, brain damaged in ways yet unknown. They're oblivious to any affection. How do we care for these babies? And what color is the baby pictured in this story? color? Black, absolutely. And what kind of a woman would give birth, would take a drug knowing it did all of these things? She must be a really horrible person. This is really the legacy of slavery that continues to play out in our country. In order to somehow rationalize the ability to take babies away from enslaved black women, you have to convince yourself on some level that they don't really care about their babies. This is a narrative that gets played over and over again, so that why would anybody believe that there was a group of any mothers who were willing to do these things to their babies? And you have this story said very explicitly. Who is the worst threat to children? Mom herself. And this was Douglas, I never remember how to pronounce his name, a part of the mythology of crack babies. And in fact, in the United States of America today, we heard that harm reduction is about love. Why is it? What is it about the human brain that is so attracted to punishment and authoritarianism as the answer, at least for some groups of people? So the worst threat to children isn't climate change, isn't poverty, isn't a country, the richest country in the world, not having universal health care. It is who? It is mom herself. And that narrative is absolutely everywhere. So even though this is an old article from the early 90s, crack babies, the worst threat is mom herself. This is an ad that was up just a few years ago by anti-choice organizations, giant billboards that say the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Not in the United States, not in Congress, but in the womb. Last week, my organization had an event. It was the first time we gave awards, and one of those awards was to Cassandra Frederick from the Drug Policy Alliance as an emerging leader. She is a black American woman. Her parents are Haitian, and she gave this incredibly moving speech about that it was in her mother's womb that she developed to become the leader that she is today. So we have to be very aware of the narratives that are out there that we're fighting that somehow fit into a brain system, a human brain system that is very tribal, that wants very simple explanations for anything. So basically, if it comes out of her vagina, it must be her fault. And what do we have to do to address that, to acknowledge it and find ways around it? Because even when we come back and say maybe what we thought was true wasn't, somehow it just keeps reemerging in waves. So eventually the research is done that says there's no such thing as crack babies. The original studies by Ira Chasnoff were based on 24 case studies. In fact, there is no specific set of harms that can be linked to prenatal exposure to cocaine or cocaine in its smokable form crack. These are just babies with certain exposures. So eventually the New York Times in 2009 runs a story, the epidemic that wasn't. It's in the health pages, not the front page. And the photo that goes with it still shows a picture. It says, treating a baby addicted to cocaine. This is after years of leading experts saying, stop calling these babies addicted. Addiction is a diagnosis or a definition that has to do with a set of behaviors. Newborns don't have those behaviors. They may have been exposed. If they were exposed to opioids, they may have a withdrawal sequence, but never is it appropriate to speak in terms of addicted babies. And in the same story that is finally undoing years of misreporting and damage, still the language that stigmatizes and harms is used. You have a version of the retraction, the correction in the Washington Post, but watch what happens. So the story is many crack babies successful, damage reports exaggerated. Okay, what color is the boy who wasn't damaged? So this is a racial story that keeps telling it over and over again. And it's not to say that white people, and particularly rural white women, aren't taken into this and harmed by it. But it helps to understand how much of this is a legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of the new Jim Crow, and how subtly, in ways that we may not normally be aware of, it gets reinforced and replayed. So, okay, so here's the Washington Post version. It says successful damage reports are exaggerated. They talk about some of the actual peer-reviewed, evidence-based research saying there just really isn't a set of things that we can call that can be blame on prenatal exposure to cocaine, a syndrome that results. The very same Washington Post story on so-called liberal MSNBC looks like this. Crack baby defies mother's curse. So even the correction reinforces an idea of individual responsibility and blame. So part of what I want to do is inoculate you against this, because this stuff just keeps coming back and back and back. And how do you break that cycle in terms of response? Because even as the hysteria around crack cocaine subsides, you then get meth babies. Meth babies are the new crack babies. They're a generation of meth babies. And while it is true that any drug that is more associated with white people has somewhat less punitive responses, less criminalization, the blame on women and the accountability only for women continues. So we have the meth baby myth emerges, and then when that starts to subside, we get the opioid scare. And that comes from an article that was published in 2012 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The lead author is Stephen Patrick. He hates when I talk about this. But what it's an example of, and this is a person, I just want to acknowledge that Stephen Patrick since then has spoken out, has testified, has been an ally in challenging punitive responses. But what I think he didn't know, and most researchers, most people who are trying so hard to get published and finish their degrees and have established their reputations, don't think about how their research will be heard by the media and by policymakers. And I suggest to you that there is a moral and ethical responsibility to think about how your research will be interpreted and used, and to write in a way that accounts for that perfectly predictable response. So the article says there's this huge increase in babies diagnosed with NAS, neonatal abstinence syndrome, something you've been asked to call neonatal opioid withdrawal. When you look closely at this study, it didn't determine what mechanisms were used to diagnose what they call NAS. Was it just a positive tox, or was it actually finding any of the symptoms, transitory and treatable symptoms of NAS? They did not determine to what extent NAS was the result of an increase in women receiving methadone and buprenorphine treatment. If you have a dependency on opioids, that is the recommended treatment by the federal government, by state governments, by the World Health Organization. But an infant prenatally exposed to those treatments may also show opioid withdrawal symptoms. So maybe the increase in reported NAS is actually a good sign. They did not determine if the care provided to newborns was necessary or medically appropriate. And they used stigmatizing and medically baseless terms such as drug-addicted newborn. And what I always want to ask is, what if that article, instead of the headline it had, was instead entitled Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome and Associated Healthcare Expenditures as a result of inappropriate hospital practices in response? Because as far as I'm concerned, that's the real story. Because even in 2012, there were studies already out showing that rooming in, keeping babies with their mothers, skin-to-skin contact, reduced the need for putting babies on medication and putting them in the most expensive place in the hospital, the neonatal intensive care unit. Since then, there have been a series of studies by Dr. Grossman and now a meta-analysis in JAMA Pediatrics affirming over and over again that guess what? The best, healthiest, and likely most cost-effective thing is keeping babies and moms together. That has something to do with love. It has something to do with recognizing the dyad between mother and baby and the value of parenting. We know that there are people who have fought very hard within their institutions to have rooming in to keep mothers and babies together, but I'm told that hospitals really aren't set up for that they aren't set up to keep families together, that nursing schedules don't want to have to go into individual rooms, that there are many long-term practices of separation that have to be overcome. So you have this new alarm. Oh my goodness, all these babies with NAS, what are we going to do? And we get a response that won't surprise you, but I just want to put it in a little bit of historical context. People in the United States have been using opioids forever, including women who get pregnant. And while I'm sure there are lots of historic problems that we can find, overall, we have, for over 100 years, had pregnant women and mothers not only using opioids, but giving them to their children when those were the only medications people had available. Where are all the damaged babies? Where's our country going to hell? This is just a recurring panic that we all buy into. So what was the result of the media coverage of the Paltrow article? You get tons of stories using the term drug-addicted newborns and conflating evidence of use with abuse and addiction and creating alarm. You have stories that talk about alarming statistics, terms like victim and victimization, which never is victimized by poor government policies. It's always by individual women who themselves often have the least power and the least structural support. And there is obvious shaming women who use drugs and women who use medications. This is a CNN report which interviews April Russell, who did what her doctors asked her to do. She got into methadone treatment. Her baby had some withdrawal symptoms. And what did she say? It's killing me. I mean, still to this day, it's hard. She starts to cry. She's a terrible woman because she did what she was supposed to do. And that's not just 10 years ago or 5 years ago. You have a Reuters investigation in 2015 that purports that misuses data to suggest that babies of mothers, whether they are in methadone treatment or not, are at greater risk of harm and should all be reported to child welfare. And just in February of 2017, another example, born addicts, opioid babies. I mean, again, alarm, blame, shame, over and over again. So what policies and laws would you expect to coincide with this kind of reporting? You get exactly what you could predict. You find that there are prosecutions of pregnant women and new mothers. You get expansion of state child welfare laws to reach women in relationship to the eggs, embryos, and fetuses they carry. You get expansion of civil commitment laws to lock up pregnant women. In Wisconsin, which I'll be talking about, you get a particular hybrid of all of those laws. In 2003, there's an amendment to the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that is very confusing to most people, but it encourages states. The states have to say there's a mechanism for connecting newborns who either are drug affected, not defined, or in withdrawal, which can also be from methadone buprenorphine treatment, to child welfare. You get some modest funding increases, but very little permanent for treatment. And you get the creation of CRAC, Children Requiring a Caring Community, a private program that offers women $300 to get sterilized or use long-acting birth control. Now, all of this, I'm just going to do a little aside here, all of this focus is on certain criminalized drugs. Studies show that all pregnant women are using drugs. They're using prescription drugs, they're using that are prescribed to them. They're using over-the-counter drugs. Most of them have not been studied for safety on fetal health. We know that there are many things that create risk factors during pregnancy. And I believe even with the current opioid scare in use, the fewest women are using any criminalized drugs. The majority of drugs used by pregnant women are marijuana. And we're talking between 5 and 10%. And yet, think about all this conference and all of the public energy and commentary focuses on the things that relate to the war on drugs, that allow us to continue a narrative of individual blame and responsibility. We look at when a woman uses drugs, the result of which is a stillbirth, a baby born with significant disabilities, all the children needing help, and it happens to be a fertility drug taken by a white Christian woman who is opposed to abortion. She gets on the cover of Good Housekeeping, and her babies are called Little Miracles. We know that cigarette smoking, we heard before about the harm reduction. One of the places where harm reduction I learned the most about is cigarette smoking in pregnancy. Tell the woman if she can't stop, cut back. Tell your patient, drink grapefruit juice when you're smoking cigarettes. It makes the cigarettes taste worse. These are harm reduction approaches, but we selectively provide those to people. I always show the picture over on the far right. That adorable redhead is me. And that's my mommy holding me and smoking a cigarette, which she did all through her pregnancy. And I like to say, maybe if she hadn't smoked cigarettes, I would be a for-profit lawyer. And we look at what happened in Flint, Michigan, with lead in the water. When you have lead in, if you test positive for lead, that's poison in your body. Testing positive for any of the criminalized drugs is not poison in your body. It's just evidence of exposure. But have any of the people who allow the lead in the water, and that really can, 20 years from now, affect children's behavior as they grow. It can do permanent damage. Where's the outrage? Where is the CDC and the meetings over and over again? How do we prevent this? It's a systemic question. It's a structural question. It's something that might hold all of us, and particularly men in power, responsible. That's not where our resources are going to go. So the policies that resulted focused on reporting, on punishment, on surveillance, despite peer-reviewed evidence based on and medical and public health consensus that these approaches are bad for maternal, fetal, and child health. And yet we come back to them. And they're bad because if you fear that by speaking honestly to your doctor, you will lose custody of your child, be arrested, you're not going to do it. Now, the truth is, a lot of the times we articulate this as a deterrent effect. If you're afraid you're going to be arrested, you're not going to go. That is true for some women. We definitely have cases of women giving birth at home, not because they want a home birth, but because they're afraid. Have women giving birth in cars on the way from Tennessee to North Carolina because they don't want to give birth in Tennessee where they could get arrested. But the truth is that most women go anyway because they care so much about their babies. And they will confess because they care so much about their babies. It is bad not only because it deters some women, but because it puts our resources into punishment instead of care, because it recycles, recreates, reinforces the narrative of individual blame, and because it adds to a country in which we have mass incarceration and mass criminalization. I know why this is it. These punitive policies are there in spite of the fact that all of these organizations, not the least of which is the National Perinatal Association, say do not do this. Do not respond to issues of drug use in pregnancy through creation of criminal laws. And the interesting thing about that is that that has had some success. That until 2014, not a single state legislature actually passed a law saying we can arrest women in relationship to their pregnancies and to their drug use. Not until 2014. And that's partly because medical organizations and doctors in each of these states, doctors who maybe play golf with the state legislators, who bother to testify, say don't do that. But what we saw instead is individual prosecutors, nevertheless, even without state authority to do it, trying out various theories so they could arrest women in relationship to their pregnancies. So if the law in the state said child endangerment is a crime, a woman who gave birth to a baby, healthy or not, charged with child endangerment. Because child endangerment is a crime that's just risk of harm. You endanger your child by leaving it home alone. You endanger your child by using cocaine. Most of the time, we were able to get the courts to say, no. The legislature decides if something's a crime, not you, individual prosecutor, and you can't use me, court, to create new law. But we did a study of arrests of women in relationship to their pregnancies and other deprivations of liberty between 1973 and 2005. And we were able to document, solid evidence of over 413 cases in 44 states and the District of Columbia. And that was until 2005. Our research showed that the targets of arrest are overwhelmingly low-income women. 52% are African American women. And what's also very frightening based on our research is that in 112 of the cases where we had the information available, the disclosure of information to the police and other state authorities was by healthcare and hospital-based employees. In other words, people who look a lot like you. So to the extent to which arrests happen and other punitive responses, people in institutions, people working with pregnant people, have a great deal of influence on whether our responses are based on health care and public health principles, or based on punishment and surveillance and control. It probably won't surprise you that since 2005, it appears that the number of arrests and the rate per year has gone up significantly. And some of that is the result of the newest wave of panic around opioids, and I think it's other factors as well. So we think that there have been more than 700 arrests since 2005, probably a lot more than that. And they apply not only in the context of drug use, but HIV. Once you open that door, which is what I'm going to explain next, if you can arrest, if you can punish based on drug use and pregnancy, what really is the theory behind that? Since many things are far more risky than using marijuana while you're pregnant, for example, the principle isn't drugs, the principle is controlling pregnant women. So I want to show you how the law works. So you arrest Cornelia Whitner in South Carolina for child endangerment. She gives birth to a healthy baby that tests positive for cocaine. She's not well represented at trial. She pleads guilty. She begs for treatment, and the judge says, no, I think I'll just send you to jail for 10 years. When we appealed, which we had done in many other states, we lost, and the court said, we don't have to address all the other ways in which this law could be used. In this case, we're only looking at cocaine, and we don't have to consider what the later down the road implications are. But the decision also said that viable fetuses in South Carolina are persons, and as a result, the state's criminal child endangerment statute applies to pregnant women who use an illicit drug or engage in any other behavior that might endanger the fetus. Now, I just want to explain something. Pregnancy endangers the fetus. Come on, 15 to 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriages and stillbirths. You allow that sperm in, you get fertilized egg, you are endangering an unborn life. That is the nature of pregnancy. That is biology. And we have not responded to the overall claim, so that more and more laws are being passed on this idea of fetal personhood and maternal liability and responsibility. Pregnancy is child endangerment. Let's just accept that and work from it, because that is what survival of the species is about. It is what biology is about. And it's true, we could have women as a second class status who, because they are biologically programmed to become pregnant and thus necessarily endanger unborn life, we can just keep them in a separate category of persons subject to an entirely different set of state laws and controls. Now, I want to acknowledge that punitive laws are always applied in this country disproportionately to low-income people, and especially black and brown people. But there are an awful lot of rural white women who are affected, and all women are affected by an ideology that defames and blames them. So Cornelia Whitner is convicted and goes to jail for 10 years. Melissa Crawley is taken back into custody on a similar charge, even though she's managed to become abstinent, is home taking care of her children, but she has to go back to jail too. Then you get an arrest in South Carolina for a woman who tested positive for marijuana. And then you get an arrest for a woman who used alcohol while she was pregnant. Then a woman who experiences a stillbirth is charged and convicted of homicide by child abuse based on a positive cocaine test. Cocaine does not cause stillbirths. If any of the criminalized drugs were good at causing pregnancy losses, I think a lot more women would be using them in a country where they can't access abortion. She had an infection. She was in mourning. Her mother had died, been run over by a truck recently, by a drunk driver. And by the way, he was not arrested. And the decision, which we did ultimately get her conviction overturned after she served 8 years, but it said a ruling that a pregnant woman who unintentionally heightens the risk of stillbirth can be found guilty of depraved heart homicide. And then it's applied to Jessica Clyburn. She's 18. She has a history of mental health issues. She's pregnant. She's distraught about her boyfriend, and she attempts suicide by jumping out of a building. Her landing is softened by a awning. Her pelvis is broken. All sorts of bones are broken. She loses her pregnancy. She's 8 months pregnant, and she's arrested on charges of homicide by child abuse. And so we then got an email from a midwife in South Carolina saying, I have a client who has babies in a breech position. We just talked to the OBGYN, and he said, I can't arrest you if you don't have cesarean surgery, but if you give birth and something goes wrong, you can be arrested in South Carolina. And that's how it flows. What else happened, maybe even more significant, what else happened in response to the media and the reporting, is what happened in the child welfare system. And that's a system that reaches far more people. Now, if you want to destroy, for example, black communities, you put the men in jail for drug trauma charges, and you tell the women, we're going to take your baby away if you don't do what we say. Mary Faith Marshall and others did a study and said, following this kind of media portrayal, although its efficacy has not been established, the most common sanctions imposed for women who test positive is temporary or permanent removal of the newborn. I have to tell you that the child welfare system in this country is an evidence-based free zone. There is no research supporting, no valid research supporting the idea that knowing somebody uses a drug tells you anything about their capacity to parent. One of the things, in addition to the media response, that sparked changes in child welfare laws in this country was something published by the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, No Safe Haven, children of substance abusing parents, saying that they found that there was the increased risk of neglect and abuse was 3 to 5%, or 3 times more likely for abuse and neglect if there were drug use. This was not a peer-reviewed study. It was a survey, an opinion survey of people in the child welfare system that the report itself admitted were not trained in addiction or evaluation. And to the extent there's been any real research, including this study by Brenda Smith, the risk of subsequent maltreatment allegations in families with substance-exposed infants, found that if you were in the child welfare system only because you had used a drug, you were not likely to be found to have abused your child in any other way. But you probably would continue to be seen as an abuser because continued use, relapse, not being abstinence becomes abuse. And so we have more than 20 states, this map is in the process of being updated, in which evidence of drug use, 20 states, say it is child abuse by definition. And other states say it must be reported, and other states say that even in the states where it doesn't have to be reported, it happens all the time. So I do this, and I encourage you to imitate me. I have brought a sample of my urine. This is mine. It's still a little warm. And I do this process. My own staff are like, why do you do this? I go through this somewhat self-humiliating process that I have the privilege of doing because I'm making a choice to say, this is how parenting is determined for way too many women, particularly brown, black, and poor rural white women. If this is positive, that is a reason to have child welfare be the first person you see after you've given birth or when you've finally gotten home with your baby. This can tell you a positive drug test makes a lot of money for drug testing companies, but it tells us very little. It can tell you, if it's accurate, that I've used a drug within a certain period of time. It doesn't tell you whether I'm drug dependent. It doesn't tell you, even if it's positive for heroin, if they can distinguish the opioids, it doesn't tell you how often I use it, how it affects my life, whether I love my children, whether I'm able to provide for my children. It tells you nothing. It is not a test for parenting, and yet drug testing companies are making billions of dollars as child welfare and everybody else use this as a substitute for an evaluation of parenting and parenting risk. And so you have families, I usually offer to pass it around. You know I'm a mother, you can tell whether I'm good or bad. These are the kind of women who have suffered the humiliation and the stress of being put in these systems. The United States government has a brochure on methadone treatment, encouraging women to get it. The one on the left is the one that existed prior to the current opioid crisis. You'll notice that I think she looks a little more black. Now that it's an opioid crisis, the silhouette of the woman looks pretty white to me. But both have this paragraph in it. So it says methadone is good, it's good for your baby, do it, it's great. But in some communities, special programs offer services for mothers in recovery. The support and practical help they provide can make a difference. Call your local CPS worker. I gotta tell you, I would not advise that. I mean, we live in a country where if you want to do something to protect children, probably the only paying job you can get is working in CPS. And then once you're in that position, you are required to pathologize poverty, to fear that you will lose your job and your livelihood if you don't report and surveil and suspect, and for which there are no rewards for being kind or compassionate or supportive. In New Jersey, the child welfare system actually took the position that being methadone treatment was child abuse because the babies sometimes are born with what they call neonatal abstinence syndrome. And the way child welfare laws work is that if there's harm, so there is, sometimes you go in and say, there's a positive drug test, there's no harm. And then they come back and they say, but if there's neonatal opioid withdrawal, that's harm. So I'm going to raise another question for you. Since when is a baby born with a health problem a harmed baby? When did that happen in the history of the United States of America? Babies are born with health problems all the time. They have colic, they have genetic disorders, they have all sorts of things. We did not in the past say that baby was harmed by being born. We now do, and we have to change that and reject that language. Some babies have health problems, those are health problems. They are not harms that justify child welfare interventions. In Massachusetts, just as an example, that state law does not require doctors or nurses or others to report positive drug tests. Yet they are told by the health department the law does. And not only that, but that they must report any patient, pregnant woman who's in methadone or buprenorphine treatment. So imagine working there, your woman finally gets into the treatment you want her to get into, and they say, oh, but I just got to tell you, when your baby's born, I've got to report you to child welfare. And the report isn't to an agency that is designed to provide services. Does anybody know an agency that provides services that it doesn't have a consequence? In Massachusetts, the report is a 51A report. It is a report of a child alleged to be suffering from abuse or neglect. Now, the child welfare agencies in Massachusetts have an option to say, okay, it's methadone, buprenorphine, we're just not going to do anything. But they might also say, I don't know what that really is. I'm going to go investigate you. I'm going to terrorize you. I'm going to hold your baby until I know what's going on. It is not a report of a woman who has succeeded by getting into health care. It is a report of suspected abuse or neglect. The experience, many of you may not know this, you have no federal constitutional right to a lawyer at a child welfare hearing. Many states do provide counsel, but in Indiana they don't. And I just want to play for you what kinds of things happen in child welfare context. This is a woman. She's a mother trying to get custody back of her child. She's representing herself.
Did you bring any proof with you that you've completed the program?
I haven't completed the program, I'm still in the program.
And what program is this?
The Evansville Treatment Center that
And why are you at the Evansville Treatment Center? Who sent you there?
I sent myself there.
How frequently do you go to the treatment center?
I go there 5 days a week.
And what are you receiving while you're there?
I'm receiving, I have to get so many minutes of counseling, individual counseling. I do groups.
I'm listening.
I have individual counseling. I do groups monthly.
Okay. What else?
And I receive methadone.
How much and how frequently?
I receive it once a day, and I'm been at 110 milligrams for a couple months now. I'm stable where I'm at. I don't feel anything off of it. I have not gone up. I get random drug screens. I've been having illicit, they make us say illicit there. They don't do clean or not clean, it's illicit or illicit. And I've had illicit drug screens since December. Everyone that I've had has been listed since December.
And they say illicit versus positive because of the fact that you're taking methadone. So they show that it's something that you've been given as opposed to an illicit drug, which is something that you would get off the street.
No, they say this is just part of their treatment. They don't want it to. They say we are not allowed to say like dose or anything like that. We say medicating. We say.
Okay, but this isn't medication. Who prescribed it for you?
The doctor. There's a doctor there.
What's the doctor's name?
Dr. Hill.
What's his first name?
I'm not sure. I just know he's Dr. Hill. He's a doctor.
Where did he graduate? No.
I'm not sure, but they know all of that.
Well, darling, if you've been into his office, typically they have I've not been to a doctor's office that doesn't have a diploma on the wall.
I didn't look to see where he went, but I know that he has one. I mean, I could get all that information for you.
That's what we're here for.
So I show this, and I have often been nervous that people will come up to me and say, that's just an exaggeration, that's unusual, and instead what they come up and tell me is to the extent there are people who've gone and watched what happens in family court in child welfare cases, they said, that's nothing. That's polite. I see some heads nodding. So a couple of things. When you believe you're a mandated reporter, you may not be. If you are a mandated reporter, really, you can do some harm reduction by making sure that you say what you observe. If this is a loving mother, if this has family support, everything you say has to be recorded and can be used to help the woman. But understand that when you make a report, it is not to an agency that is kind or gentle or loving or set up structurally to be supportive. This is what you're sending people to. So you might want to think very, very carefully about what your obligations are, if they are real at all. Because in Massachusetts, the health department and hospital policy says you must report a positive tox, you must report being in methadone or buprenorphine treatment, but actually that's not what the law says, and the doctors are not required to do those things. You are required to report everywhere if you're seeing something that makes you think this parent really can't parent. That cannot be determined by this. It's hard to determine because our standards of good parenting there's no objective standard. If you have real reason to fear, absolutely call child welfare. But even then, you want to make sure that the person that you have given that person the benefit of the doubt and as much information to the agency as possible. Here are some other laws that have came into being. In Wisconsin, the whole crack baby scare became a mechanism for arming the local pro-life cause, by which they meant in 1997, when it was already clear that there was no such thing as a crack baby, anti-abortion lobbyists amended the state's civil child welfare law to create the Unborn Child Protection Act. And what that means is if a woman goes in and admits that she even used drugs in the past, she can be reported to the state for unborn child abuse and told that she must go to residential treatment. In Alicia Beltran's case, she had stopped using any kind of drugs by 11 weeks of pregnancy, admitted this to her doctors, was so proud, and out of ignorance, they were like, oh, you weaned yourself off opioids, and you got yourself Suboxone to help you do that, and you're not using any drugs now, but you shouldn't stop using them. We need to get you back on Suboxone. The next thing she knows, she's handcuffed, shackled, taken into a courtroom where her 14-week fetus gets a lawyer, and she does not. And then she's ordered to go to a treatment program that doesn't provide Suboxone or any other medication treatments. Tammy Lacher seeks help from her doctors. Her biggest problem is lack of medication for a thyroid problem. She admits to having used some drugs in the past. She's reported to child welfare. They want to lock her up in a drug treatment program. She refuses. She is put in jail. The lawyer for her fetus argues she's in contempt of court. She's put in jail, and when she says, I need to get my thyroid medication and go to my prenatal care appointments, they say, we can't do that unless you take a pregnancy test. And she refuses, and they put her in solitary confinement for 3 days. So this is what happens when we think that we are helping by empowering state authorities to take custody of pregnant women. Legislation, there has been very little, because organizations like the NPA and others have spoken out, very little specific authority. But we have to be careful how we get to that. So in response to the so-called opioid crisis, Tennessee starts doing a statewide surveillance, which there's a lot of recommendation for that. It's so great, we're getting more and more numbers. How are those numbers used? They're used to convince the legislature to pass a law specifically authorizing the arrest of women in relationship to drug use. Yeah, I'll take questions since I'm going on. Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this question, probably not, but why do you think it is that there's this target on pregnant women's back that everybody has to try and imprison them or do something for that woman or that baby that doesn't need to be done? What is it in this society that's doing that? It makes me physically sick.
Well, you know, that's the big question. Why I'm asking you, it's about how human brains work. It is a very useful approach. It keeps us distracted. Blaming pregnant women for unhealthy children means that the government doesn't have to do anything other than get the women to stop using drugs. But it's also a narrative and a policies. We live in a country that was founded on slavery, that said you can take people and deprive them of their freedom and torture them through work and starvation and battery and rape. And we somehow think, where did that go? Where did that concept that that's okay to do to other human beings go? It's gotten spread out, reapplied in other ways, including to pregnant women, starting with and focused first on Black women. So we'll keep talking about that. I want to get through a few more of these. West Virginia, we're seeing a lot more laws being proposed. Fortunately, this didn't pass most recently, but this is a law that would have allowed testing of pregnant women without their consent, forced treatment, if they didn't force treatment, arrest. But part of the statute was their definitional section of addiction. And if you notice number 3, addiction was defined by the legislature, this is what they tried to do, as non-prescribed controlled substance use by pregnant women. We're just going to legislate a definition of addiction. And I want to bring this to your attention. Our current president has stated that he's seriously thinking about the death penalty for drug dealers. He's a great admirer of Duterte in the Philippines and the death penalty in Singapore. And you know why? You should be concerned about this anyway. For anybody. Drug dealers, by the way, aren't all Noriega. Very often, drug dealing and drug delivery is just you have a lot of drugs on you, so it must mean you're a dealer. But if you have a high tolerance for drugs, you're going to have a lot on you. But among the crimes that pregnant women have been charged with, and most of the women in our study were charged with some kind of crime related to the use of a criminalized drug, but is drug distribution and drug delivery. So among those who he could be reaching towards for the death penalty for drug delivery are women like these who've been arrested on theories of drug delivery to a minor through the umbilical cord. And I assure you, in this country with lack of compassion, you open the door for some other group of people you think, well, they're not me, they're not my issue. Just understand precedent. The next group is the group you are in or care about. The Bighorn County prosecutor issued a statement recently saying that pregnant women who use alcohol or drugs, not even addicted, should turn themselves in, and their neighbors and their friends and their doctors should turn themselves in. Otherwise, he's going to have civil commitment or some kind of civil commitment proceeding, and if they don't obey, they will go to jail. The precedent there is you have, in Alabama, you have the Supreme Court of Alabama taking a law designed to punish adults who bring children to meth labs, to turning the womb into a dangerous environment for the fetus and allowing women to be arrested who use any amount of any controlled substance. Anti-choice activists are citing that decision to say, look, if you can put women in jail for smoking marijuana, we certainly should be able to put them in jail for having abortions. So if you, whatever your opinion is about abortion, and I respect that, understand, however, that we are talking about what we're fighting is mass criminalization of pregnant women. 6 million women get pregnant every year. Among those are people who define themselves as men, and I include those in this group. And it's not true that every one of those women will be at risk. Whiteness, economic privilege, other protections will help. But all of those, a very large number of those, could become the subjects of mass incarceration. I want to end with some victories are possible, dignity and decency are possible. In South Carolina, where they were arresting women out of their hospital beds with a policy where the doctors were working with the police and prosecutors, we challenged that and won in the U.S. Supreme Court in the Ferguson decision. If you are reporting patients knowing that they could end up in jail, you could be liable for damages. The Tennessee law, there was so much opposition to it by groups like Healthy and Free Tennessee and Sister Reach that they put a sunset clause in. It said after 2 years this will go out of effect if it isn't reenacted. And working with those groups and the National Perinatal Association and doing conferences in Tennessee and bringing shame to the state for their arrest, that law was allowed to sunset in 2016. Amnesty International has issued a report calling on these kinds of arrests as violations of international human rights principles, and a UN report on arbitrary detention in the U.S. specifically said that what was happening in Tennessee and Alabama violates international human rights norms. While we have not won in the courts in Alabama, a series by ProPublica and AL.com resulted in some women having charges dropped. The expose of literally hundreds of women being arrested based on only a single positive drug test. It also clarified at least that the law could not be used against women who are prescribed medications. In New Jersey, we won the decision saying being methadone treatment is not civil child welfare, but nevertheless, child welfare abuse in the civil system, nevertheless, those kinds of actions continue to take place. A federal district court judge struck down the Wisconsin Unborn Child Protection Act, first federal court decision like that, but the state is appealing, and it could go all the way to the Supreme Court. What can we do? We need to remove the barriers to treatment for everyone. I actually think laws that prioritize pregnant women are wrong, because pregnant women have husbands and boyfriends and children who need treatment too. And if they can get it and their kids and their husbands and their boyfriends can't, what are they going to do? They're not going to go, or they're going to take whatever help they get and pass it on to them. It has to be for everybody. You cannot segregate. We need to ensure that prenatal care providers are authorized waiver to provide buprenorphine. We need to have signs in prenatal care settings that say, you have confidential care, don't worry. You will be protected here. We need to change child welfare. We need to limit their role. So as long as their first and primary function is removing children from parents, putting parents into essentially on probation without any due process in order to get their kids back, we must stop that and challenge it. We should all make the observation of child welfare proceedings mandatory for anybody who believes they're a mandatory reporter. You should be finding the parent defense lawyers and going with them and saying, you want to graduate from this course, you want a good grade for me, you want a good evaluation for me, tell me you've done and watched what actually happens in the court at least 3 times. Require healthcare providers and researchers to investigate and consider how their research is going to be interpreted before it is published. And anything you do that is compassionate and respectful may be for somebody who is identified as a drug user, who's called an addict. If you are compassionate and kind, it may be the first person who's ever been compassionate and kind to them. And it isn't going to magically fix everything, but it is planting a seed. And I have heard so many people say that the beginning of recovery, and I don't mean abstinence only, I mean having a better life, feeling like they have some control, came from a healthcare provider who finally looked them in the eye, listened to them, and was compassionate. We have to change our focus. This is the approach we usually use, which helps it answer the question from the audience about why is it punitive? If you're focusing on a healthy pregnancy, we tell don't smoke, don't drink, don't use illegal drugs, manage your stress, all of those things. That leads to a punitive response, an individual response, an individual responsibility with a punitive response. This is an alternative vision. If you're looking at social determinants, let's just be honest. Don't be poor. If you can, stop. Don't have poor parents. Don't live in a poor neighborhood. Practice not losing your job. Don't be illiterate. And try not to be part of a racially or socially marginalized group. The ACOG committee says you have an obligation to challenge reporting laws. The AMA says you have an obligation to exercise conscience, to challenge punitive, inappropriate laws. And we have to, as Joelle told us earlier, we have to see people for their whole selves and give them the respect and dignity they deserve as human beings. It's about human rights, it's about human dignity, and it is about the work that all of you do and the radical work you can do to change a culture of punishment to one of love and dignity. Thank you.
CARA federal act, I think makes reporting of how do they say substance-exposed neonates more of an issue. Do you have any comments around that?
Yes, there is no. I think what they still use the language of drug effective, which is not the same. When you're a lawyer, the rule is that every word in a statute means something. So, and if they wanted to say substance exposed, they could have, but they said drug affected, which I think they thought there was some impact that they were trying to fix. But it gets interpreted by HHS as substance exposed. So that is wrong. And there has been no organization devoted to the intersection of drug use and child welfare. We should be repealing the captive provisions and the CARA amendments that require connecting issues of drug use and pregnancy with the punitive civil child welfare system. I know we did write letters. It is a part of our work, but it is only a part of the work of a staff of 8. It means that NPA and others should be trying to repeal it. I know ACOG is paying attention. We've been pushing the Drug Policy Alliance, which is an organization we should all investigate and think about joining, because the drug war and the war on women are all connected. And they are investigating how could we repeal this, but that's going to take a generation of work. And whoever you are, write to your legislator and say, this is crap. This is not protecting children.